So what if every single 1 mana enchantment in your deck was actually 2 Rhinos in a trench coat? That is the concept of what we're doing with this deck tech. So welcome, settle in, get comfy. We'll try and make this a little shorter than the last one, but I have a lot to go over to show you guys this cool new deck that I've put together. So this is Wildsear Scouring Maw. This is a new commander from the Bloomburrow Commander Precons. It is 5 mana, 3 generic, a red and a green, for a legendary creature Elemental Wolf that is a 6/6 with trample. So already off the bat, pretty big body. 6/6 trample for 5 is pretty good. But the really exciting part about this card is it says enchantment spells that you cast from your hand have Cascade. And for those of you unfamiliar with Cascade, the reminder text is whenever you cast an enchantment spell from your hand, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less, and then you may cast it without paying its mana cost. Put the exile cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. So what we're doing with this deck is we are biased towards running as many 1 mana enchantments as possible, so that way when we have our commander out, Wildsear Scouring Maw, and we cast a 1 mana enchantment, we are going to cascade for a spell that costs 0 mana. And the trick to this deck is that we're only running 2 spells that cost 0 mana, so whenever we cast one of these 23 1 mana enchantments that we have in the deck, we are going to cascade until we hit one of those 2 0 mana spells that we have in the deck. For those of you who played Modern before it all changed with the release of Modern Horizons 3 and the banning of that 3 mana Cascade card, I forget what it's called. There used to be a Rhino deck in Modern. So we're kind of taking a page out of Modern's playbook here with this card, Crashing Footfalls. Let's actually take a closer look here. So you'll notice at the top there's actually no mana cost on this card. It has an ability called Suspend, where you can pay a green to suspend this for 4 turns, and then at the end of the 4th turn you cast it for free. We're almost never going to be doing that in this deck. The reason why we're running it is because since there's no mana cost at the top, that means that technically this has a mana value of 0, meaning that whenever we cast a 1 mana enchantment, we are either going to hit this or the other 0 mana card in our deck. We'll get to that in a minute. This one says create 2 4/4 green Rhino creature tokens with trample. So with Wildsear out, whenever we cast one of our 23 1 mana enchantments that we're running in this deck, we are going to cascade until we either hit a Crashing Footfalls, which makes us 2 Rhino tokens that are 4/4 tramplers, or we will cascade until we hit our other 0 mana spell, Lotus Bloom, which essentially is just going to give us a Black Lotus. This is a Black Lotus with Suspend, but again, if you hit it off of that Cascade trigger with Wildsear, it's just going to put it directly into play, meaning that it is a 0 mana artifact that you can tap and sacrifice to add 3 mana of any one color. So that is the gist of what we're trying to do in this deck. We are going to be casting enchantments. We've put a lot of enchantment support into this deck with the Enchantresses that we're able to run. We'll get a little further into that a little later in the video. But basically, we're trying to get to Wildsear as fast as possible, cast a 1 mana enchantment, cascade into either Crashing Footfalls or Lotus Bloom. If we do hit the Lotus Bloom before we hit Footfalls, that's going to give us more mana to continue chaining enchantments until we get to our Crashing Footfalls. Now, one glaring flaw with this strategy is once you cascade into one of these cards, it's going to be put into play, and then it's no longer going to be in your deck. Crashing Footfalls will go to the graveyard. Lotus Bloom will go into play, and then as soon as you use it, it will go into your graveyard. So a significant chunk of the cards we're running in this deck are cards that can shuffle cards from graveyards back into the library. Because again, if we do shuffle these back in, it doesn't matter if they're on the very bottom. We have some cards that just put them back onto the bottom of our library. Even if we put it from our graveyard onto the bottom, the next time that we cast a 1-mana enchantment spell with Wildsear out, we will Cascade all the way until we hit this off the bottom of our library once again. So let's look at the different categories of which cards we're including in this deck to make this strategy work. Since I just mentioned it, we can start with our reshuffle abilities. Remember, once we get Wildsear into play and we cast those 1-mana enchantments, we have 23 of them. We are going to quickly use both of these cards and then need to shuffle them back in to continue cascading into them. So we are running 13 cards that shuffle from our graveyard back into our library, or put a card from our graveyard on the bottom of our library. Really quickly, let's take a look at which of those we are running. So Blessed Respite is a 2-mana instant. Target player shuffles their graveyard into their library. Prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. This is a sweet include because not only does it shuffle our Crashing Footfalls back into our library, but it is also a fog effect, which can be very useful in a game of Commander to get someone who's swinging at you with most of their board. You can protect yourself from that and shuffle your important 0-drop cards back into your library. We have a Bow of Nylea. This card is really nice because not only... Well, let's read it first. It's a 3-mana legendary enchantment artifact that says attacking creatures you control have Death Touch. And then it has an activated ability where you can pay 2 mana and tap it and choose one. You can either put a 1/1 counter on target creature, or Bow of Nylea deals 2 damage to target creature with flying, or you gain 3 life, or, and this is the important one, you can put up to 4 target cards from your graveyard on the bottom of your library in any order. So you can, once this is down on the field, you can repeatedly pay the 2 mana to keep putting your Crashing Footfalls on the bottom of your library, so then you can keep casting 1-mana enchantment spells to keep cascading into it as many times as you are able to do so. This is a great include for a few reasons. For one, you'll notice that it is an enchantment, so when Wildsear is already on the board, you can cast it, and this itself is also going to cascade into something that costs less than 3 mana, so you get a free card off of just casting this thing. Giving attacking creatures Death Touch is really nice when you're attacking with Tramplers, because the interaction of Death Touch and Trample is such that if you attack with Wildsear, or if you attack with one of your Crashing Footfalls trampling Rhino tokens, let's just for the sake of this example use Wildsear. If I attack into an opponent who has a 4/4 blocker, and Wildsear is a 6/6 trample and has Death Touch because of our Bow of Nylea, the way that damage is going to work is that Wildsear just has to deal enough damage to kill the blocking creature before the rest of the trample damage goes through to your opponent. So with Death Touch, that means that Wildsear only has to deal 1 damage to the 4/4 blocker. That will kill it, and then the rest of the 5 trampling damage will go straight through to the opponent. So Trample Death Touch is a pretty sweet combination of abilities that you can use to push a lot of damage through. Most of the time, opponents won't even bother blocking when you have this Bow of Nylea out. And then also, obviously, it's great. It has a lot of flexibility. Most of the time, you're going to be using it to put your Crashing Footfalls back on the bottom of your library so you can continue cascading into it. We have a Conjurer's Bauble. This is an awesome card. It's just a 1-mana artifact that you can sacrifice, tap and sacrifice to draw a card. You can put up to 1 target card from your graveyard onto the bottom of your library. This is a one-time use, put Crashing Footfalls back on the bottom, but it's sweet because it replaces itself and it only costs 1 mana. You can just leave it on the board until you're ready to crack it and put the Footfalls back on the bottom of your library. Cranial Archive, a little bit less efficient than the Conjurer's Bauble. You have to pay the 2 mana to get it down initially, and then you can pay 2 mana and exile it. Target player shuffles his or her graveyard into his or her library, draw a card. So obviously you can pay the 2 mana to shuffle your graveyard back into your library, draw a card, so it does still replace itself, which is nice. Another thing that can be said about a lot of these abilities that say target player, you can target opponents' graveyards as well. If you're going up against an opponent who's trying to do graveyard stuff in general, reanimation, Underworld Breach, hopefully you don't see a whole lot of that in your pod because that is a very powerful strategy, but anything like that, you can kind of, you can use these as hate pieces against graveyard strategies as well. Obviously, that's not the primary function of them. You most of the time will be using this to put your Crashing Footfalls back into your deck. But if necessary, you can hit an opponent's graveyard with these kind of abilities as well. Let's keep going. We have an Elixir of Immortality. This is kind of a classic card. It is a 1 mana artifact that you can pay 2 mana, tap and sacrifice to gain 5 life, shuffle the Elixir of Immortality and your graveyard into its owner's library. So this is a repeatable shuffle ability. It shuffles itself back in, meaning that you can find it later on in the game to continue shuffling that Crashing Footfalls back in and continue making Rhinos. Endurance, great card. If you pay the 3 mana for it, it's a 3/4 flash reach creature, so you can surprise block something. While then when it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target player puts all cards from their graveyard on the bottom of their library in a random order. So this can put your pieces back into your library. It also obviously has Evoke, so you can exile a green card from your hand instead of paying this card's mana value. So you can exile a green card and then put this thing into play for free, and then it's immediately sacrificed, but you still get that enter the battlefield ability, so that's a pretty good trick to use in this deck. Feldon's Cane is an old school card. It's a 1 mana artifact that you can tap and reshuffle your graveyard into your library and then exile Feldon's Cane. We have Gaia's Blessing. Target player shuffles up to 3 target cards from their graveyard into their library and then draw a card. So it replaces itself. It lets you put up to 3 cards from your graveyard back into your library. And then it also has extra text at the bottom here that says when it is put into your graveyard from your library, shuffle your graveyard into your library. This isn't going to come up a whole lot. We're not milling ourselves, but if for some reason you are going up against a mill deck or a combo deck that's looking to mill their opponents out, this is actually going to be a lifesaver, because if someone tries to go for milling out your library and this is in your library, it'll hit your graveyard from your library and shuffle everything back in, meaning that you can't really be milled out with this deck as long as this is in the deck and not in your hand or graveyard. So that's a nice little bonus on this one. Recursion Reclamation, 2 mana instant. Target player shuffles up to 2 target cards from his or her graveyard into his or her library, and then you can reuse it with flashback. So you get 2 uses off of this thing, which is nice. You can save it in your graveyard for later. It's got instant speed, so yeah, that's pretty good. Loaming Shaman, 3 mana, 3/2 Centaur Shaman creature, and when it enters the battlefield, target player shuffles any number of target cards from their graveyard into their library. We have just a few more of these effects, but you're starting to get the idea that we're running a lot of these so that we can reliably use these kind of abilities once we have already used our Crashing Footfalls. We have a Soul Debbie Digger. This one is spicy. This is actually a reserveless card that is still very affordable. It's kind of annoying because it's one of the very few cards in the history of Magic the Gathering that actually cares about the order of your graveyard. Technically, it is a rule in Magic that the order of your graveyard matters and has to be consistent. So as a card enters your graveyard, it's going to remember the order in which it entered. So the next card to enter after that one will stack on top of it, and then the next card will stack on top of it. But let's just read the card. This is a 2 mana artifact that says you can pay 2 mana to put the top card of your graveyard on the bottom of your library. So this one is cool because you can repeat that ability as many times as you like. You just have to time it so that the crashing footfalls that you want to put back into your library, back into the bottom, is the most recent card to have entered into your graveyard. And as long as that's the top card, you can just keep doing that over and over. So this is a powerful piece that allows you to keep making Rhinos. Similarly, we have a Tomb Trawler. This is a much newer card. 2 mana, 0/4 artifact creature golem that says you can pay 2 mana to put target card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. This one does not care if it's the top card. You can just pick a card and put it on bottom. And then the last of these shuffle abilities we have, or tuck abilities, is Turn the Earth, a 1 mana instant that says choose up to 3 target cards in graveyards, and then the owners of those cards shuffle them into their libraries. You gain 2 life and flashback for 2, so you can use this card twice, which is nice. Another nice thing about this one is you don't have to target a single player. If you just want to put your crashing footfalls back into your deck, you can do that. And then you still have 2 other cards that you can pick, and you can pick those from other players' graveyards. So again, if you're worried about graveyard stuff, you can shuffle a card from one opponent's library or graveyard back in, and a card from another opponent's graveyard back in, should you decide to do that. So that is all of the abilities we have to shuffle our 0 mana spells back into our deck. In those examples that I was giving, I was saying that oftentimes you're going to want to shuffle the crashing footfalls back in, and I think that is mostly the case. That's how you're going to win primarily with this deck, is by trampling over with a lot of rhinoceros damage. But again, important to note that you can choose to shuffle the Lotus Bloom back in as necessary as well, if you need some mana and just some gas to fuel this engine of casting Cascade spells. So that's really up to you in the situation of deciding, hey, I want to shuffle just this back in so I'm guaranteed to hit my Crashing Footfalls. I want to shuffle both back in so that I have the option to hit either or if you wanted to, you can control just shuffling the Lotus Bloom back in to only hit that if for some reason you just needed that boost of 3 mana. So that's what's going on with our shuffle abilities. Let's look at the enchantments that we're actually running in this deck. But actually, I think before we get into that, let's look at ways that we're going to be ramping into our commander Wildsear, because without Wildsear, none of this really works. So it's going to be very important to get to this 5 mana commander as soon as possible. The way that we're going to be doing that is we're ramping into it, but specifically the ramp that we're using in this deck, a lot of it is enchantment-based ramp that will serve a dual purpose, so that in the early game, you just put it down to try to get to your Wildsear as soon as possible, but then later in the game, once Wildsear is out, it still serves the purpose of cascading into more spells for you, so it's not just a dead draw later on. You'll notice we have 19 ramp spells, so a good chunk of this deck is dedicated to ramping into our commander as fast as we can. Generally, we want to put a 1 mana ramp spell on turn 1, and then a 3 mana ramp spell on turn 2, so that on turn 3 we can hit Wildsear. That isn't going to happen every time, but it's not unrealistic either. We're running a lot of 1 mana ramp spells and a lot of 3 mana ramp spells to facilitate that curve. Speaking of 1 mana ramp spells, let's look at Birds of Paradise. Classic card. It's not an enchantment, but I have chosen to include it here because it can be played on turn 1 to curve into that turn 3 Wildsear. This is a 3 mana ramp spell, Blighted Burgeoning. We have a lot of cards that are within this sort of archetype that are 3 mana enchantment auras that you put on a land, and then when you put it on a land you control, it makes it so that land taps for an extra mana, meaning that you can put it on a land and then tap that land for 2 mana, so it ramps you. And then each one comes with its own little bit of like extra gravy on top of it. This one lets you incubate 2 when it enters, so you make a artifact token with 2 1/1 counters on it, and then you can pay 2 mana to turn that artifact into a 2/2 creature. Not super important, we're mostly just running it because it's an enchantment that will ramp us into Wildsear in the early game, and then in the late game, again, this will trigger off of Wildsear, so it'll cascade into more cards, and it also sort of fits into our Enchantress package that we're running, which I'll get into later. We have Carpet of Flowers, great magic card. It's especially great in this deck because it is a 1-mana enchantment, meaning that once Wildsear is out, when we cast this, it will cascade into our Crashing Footfalls or our Lotus Bloom. Fertile Ground, good 2-mana enchantment, ramp. You put it on a land, the land taps for extra mana. We have a lot of those kind of abilities once again, so we're just going to sort of scooch past that one. Font of Fertility is a 1-mana enchantment, so again, triggers Wildsear, cascades into Rhinos. You can also pay 2 mana and sacrifice it to search for a basic land, put it into play tapped and shuffle. Gift of Paradise, another one of those 3-mana land enchantments, makes it tap for 2, and when it enters you gain 3 life. Grafted Growth, another one of that same genre. This time when it enters, you put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control, which actually is notable for Wildsear, because Wildsear is going to be our plan B in this deck if for some reason our Footfalls gets exiled or we're just not able to make as many Rhinos as we would have hoped to. Wildsear can kill with commander damage fairly easily, just considering how giant it is, and it has a trample as well. So that 1/1 counter is actually kind of important because it brings Wildsear from 6 damage up to the magic number in commander of 7. When you have a commander that's hitting for 7 damage, that means that it is into 3 strikes you're out territory, because 7 times 3 is a clean 21. It's always nice to have a commander that's attacking for 7 damage. It means you only have to hit an opponent 3 times with that 7 damage to kill them. So another reason why this Grafted Growth is especially kind of nice in this deck. We have Llanowar Elves for that turn 1 ramp that will ideally ramp us into a turn 2 one of these 3-mana spells. Mana Bloom is really cool in this deck. This is 1-mana enchantment with X as well, and it says Mana Bloom enters the battlefield with X charge counters on it, and then you can remove a charge counter from Mana Bloom to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Activate this ability only once each turn. And then it says at the beginning of your upkeep, if Mana Bloom has no charge counters on it, return it to its owner's hand. So this is going to serve a lot of different functions in this deck. For one, it's ramp. If you pay a green and then X is 1, so 2 mana for it early in the game, you can then have it enter with 1 charge counter on it, and on a later turn remove that charge counter to help you cast Wildsear as early as possible. A couple other cool things about this are you can cast this where X is 0, and when Wildsear is out, you can do that, and it's going to have mana value of 1 while it's on the stack, meaning that it can cascade into a Crashing Footfalls. The way that X spells work with Cascade is it counts whatever the mana value that you put into X while it's on the stack. So if I cast this while Wildsear is out on the field and X is 2, this is going to have a mana value of 3 on the stack, meaning I cascade until I hit something that costs less than 3. But if I want to guaranteed hit that Crashing Footfalls, I can just play this where X is 0, meaning that its mana value is 1, and it will go hit Footfalls or Lotus Bloom. The other awesome thing about this is it returns itself to your hand at the beginning of your turn if it has no charge counters on it. So you can use this over and over to continue cascading, to continue hitting your Crashing Footfalls. If you think you need to go for a different kind of spell, you can make X larger, so it's very versatile in that way, all while still ramping you in the process. So this is one of the better, more synergistic cards in the deck. We also have New Horizons, basically exactly the same thing as Grafted Growth. Enters the battle, 3-mana aura, goes on a land, makes the land tap for 2 mana, so it's ramping you. And when it enters, you can put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control. Overgrowth is one of the better versions of this ability. It is a 3-mana enchant land that makes it so that the land taps for 2 additional green mana. So this is actually ramping you 2 when it comes down. That is pretty good for 3 mana. Sanctum Weaver, another really great ramp piece for this deck. It is itself an enchantment, so it's going to trigger Wildsear, and then it is a 2 mana 0/2 Dryad enchantment creature. Taps to add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of enchantments you control. Early in the game, this will ramp you to Wildsear fairly efficiently. Later in the game, this is going to be tapping for 5, 6, 7 mana, so you can get a lot of value out of this. Sheltered Aerie, the most basic version of this type of card. 3 mana, goes on a land taps for 2 mana. Soul Ring, obviously. Utopia Sprawl, this one is very good because it comes down on turn 1, meaning it ramps you into the turn 2 3 mana ramp spell for the turn 3 Wildsear. 1 mana enchant Forest specifically. As it comes into play, choose a color. Whenever Enchanted Forest is tapped for a mana, its controller adds 1 mana of the chosen color. So yeah, 1 mana to make a land tap for 2 mana. Very good. Verdant Haven. Disc is almost full. Hopefully we don't run out of space here, but we're just going to continue. Verdant Haven says enchant land. Again, enters the battlefield, gain 2 life, land taps for 2 mana. Weirding Wood, goes on a land, makes a tap for 2 mana. This time you investigate, which is really cool because then you can pay 2 mana later on, sacrifice the clue that you make to draw a card. Wild Growth is great. Like Utopia Sprawl, it can come down on turn 1. It enchants a land and makes the land tap for 2 mana of any color. Again, importantly, it is a 1 mana enchantment, so later on with Wildsear out, this will cascade and get you some Rhinos. And then the last one, Wolf Willow Haven, is a 2 mana version of that ability. Enchant a land. When it's tapped, it gives you an additional green, and then it has an ability to make some wolf tokens, but I think you're almost never going to do that. This is, again, just a ramp piece here. So those are all of the ramp cards we're running in this deck. Really the goal is to ramp into Wildsear as quickly as possible, so that way we can start casting one of our many 1 mana enchantment spells and making some rhinoceroses as soon as we can. Again, this may seem like a lot of ramp, but the cool thing about it is these are still going to be good later in the game because they cascade when Wildsear is out. And also, they are going to play into our Enchantress package, which I guess I will get into right now. A lot of you are going to be familiar with how Enchantresses function, but essentially they are cards that synergize with playing a lot of enchantments. We have 6 cards that synergize with that specifically. So we have an Eidolon of Blossoms. This is a 4 mana 2/2 enchantment creature, so it itself is an enchantment, which is nice. And it says Constellation, so whenever Eidolon of Blossoms or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So with this card out, whenever you're playing those redundant ramp spells later in the game, you're at least going to be drawing into new cards and ideally cascading into new cards as well. So you can get a lot of value even just off of playing those sort of generic ramp spells. We have an Elvish Archivist, which is a 2 mana 0/1 Elf Artificer. Says whenever 1 or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control, you put 2 1/1 counters on Archivist. This triggers once each turn. Sometimes that's going to happen with, we have a few artifacts in here, especially the Lotus Bloom, but the more important piece is whenever 1 or more enchantments enter under your control, draw a card. This ability triggers once each turn. So again, it's an Enchantress. As you play enchantments, you will draw more cards, so you can play more enchantments, so you can draw more cards, so etc., etc. We have Enchantress's Presence, a 3 mana enchantment that says whenever you cast an enchantment spell, draw a card. It's more redundant. It's just going to keep fueling that strategy of casting enchantments. Nessian Wanderer is a 2 mana 1/3 Satyr Scout that says Constellation. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a land card from among them and put that card into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This one's really good too. It's almost like drawing a card. You're only going to draw land each time, but pretty much every time an enchantment enters, this is going to draw you a land card. So that's pretty great. Setessan Champion, another Enchantress, 3 mana, 1/3 human warrior with Constellation. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on Setessan Champion and draw a card. And then the last Enchantress that we have is Verduran Enchantress. This is 3 mana, human druid, 0/2. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you may draw a card. So a lot of this deck is sort of built to fuel this engine that we have of enchantresses for each enchantment that we cast. We want to be drawing more cards, and then we want to be cascading off of our commander as well. And that's sort of how it's going to fuel itself. That's how our card draw package works here, and how we can continue doing the things that we want to do in this deck, namely making bunches of Rhinos. So with all of that being said, let's actually take a look at our 1 mana enchantments specifically. As I alluded to earlier in the video, we are running 23 of them in this deck. Some of them we've already gone over in our ramp package, but we're just going to start going through these, kind of rapid fire them off, and then if there's anything particularly notable about them, we'll dig a little deeper. Abundant Growth is not actually a ramp spell. It is enchant a land, and then enchanted land has tap to add a mana of any color, so it's fixing, it's not ramping, but importantly, when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. So that's great. It replaces itself, it helps find you more pieces, it helps draw into other 1-drop enchantments so you can keep going. Audacity, this serves a couple of functions. It says enchant creature, enchanted creature has +2/+0 and has trample. And then when it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you draw a card. So it replaces itself. It is a 1 mana enchantment, so it cascades into your Crashing Footfalls. And it also plays into the sort of commander damage plan B that we have going on with this deck, because you can put it onto Wildsear to make Wildsear bigger and hit for more damage, while in the process also making Rhinos. Bequeathal's cool. Again, you're going to notice we're running a lot of these cards that sort of draw us more cards, so we can just keep going and keep making more Rhino tokens. This one is a 1 mana enchant creature, which is an aura. So if enchanted creature is put into any graveyard, draw 2 cards. So this is potentially 1 mana, draw 2. You can put it on an opponent's creature if you think that creature is going to die, or you can put it on one of your own creatures as well. Again, 1 mana enchantment, cascades into Footfalls. Carpet of Flowers we talked about, great ramp piece. Crown of Flames. This one is one of the better cards in the deck, and there's a green version of it as well. This is 1 red for enchant creature, enchanted, and then it has fire breathing, so you can pay a red to give enchanted creature +1/+0 until end of turn. That kind of plays again into the commander damage game plan, but the really cool piece of this card is you can pay a red to return it to its owner's hand. So once you have your Tomb Trawler, your Soldevi Digger, your Bow of Nylea, your repeatable ability to put your Crashing Footfalls back into your deck, and then once you have this Crown of Flames, or there's another version of it, Whip Silk. Oh, hold on. Whip Silk. Once you have one of these cards and then a repeatable way to put the Crashing Footfalls back into your library, you can just pay a green, or with the case of the other one, pay a red, return this to your hand, cast it again. Return it to your hand for a mana, cast it again, and you can keep doing that for as much as you have the mana to keep putting the Crashing Footfalls back into your library. So these 2 cards are very good engine pieces that allow you to just keep going. If you have one of your Enchantresses out, you can use them to just keep drawing cards over and over again. Mana is really the only bottleneck here, but especially if you're cascading into Lotus Bloom to get more mana off of it, it can just kind of let you go off. So this is a great card. We will go ahead and move on to Curse of Opulence. already just a played commander card. It's a 1 mana enchant player. Whenever enchanted player is attacked, create a gold token, and then each opponent attacking that player does the same. So it incentivizes opponents to attack another opponent because they get gold off of it, but you are also going to get gold, and it also makes it so whenever you attack that player, you get gold as well. This could almost kind of be considered ramp. I was thinking about putting it into the ramp category, but it's not as guaranteed. However, oftentimes if this does come down early game, it's going to help ramp you into Wildsear as well. We have Dragon's Mantle. Enchanted creature has fire breathing. You can pay a red to give it +1 attack, so again, fits the commander damage theme. But yeah, most importantly, when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. So you can keep going, you draw another card. It might be another 1-drop enchantment that lets you keep cascading. Fang of Shigeki, just a 1 mana, 1/1 death touch creature. It's a great blocker, but it is also an enchantment, so it feels all those same synergies. Font of Fertility we talked about in the ramp section. Hidden Predators. This is a spicy one, probably a card not a lot of people know about, and surprisingly affordable too. It is just a 1 mana enchantment that says, when one of your opponents controls a creature with power 4 or greater, if Hidden Predators is an enchantment, Hidden Predators becomes a 4/4 creature that is a beast. So this, as long as your opponent has a 4-power creature out, one of your opponents, which is pretty likely in a game of Commander, this is just a 1 mana 4/4 beast creature that's also an enchantment. So yeah, it's going to trigger our Cascade, but it's also just a 1 mana 4/4. So if you cast this and Cascade into your Crashing Footfalls, this is actually 1 mana for 3 4/4 creatures. The 2 Rhinos trample, this one does not. But yeah, 1 mana for 3 4/4s is pretty great. Keen Sense, this is more just card draw. It's a 1 mana enchant creature. Whenever enchanted creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. Mana Bloom we talked about, fantastic, flexible, reusable piece in this deck. Mark of Fury, also fantastic and reusable. This is 1 mana, enchanted creature gains haste, so you can attack with your Wildsear the turn it comes down as long as you have that 1 extra mana. But it also says at the end of turn, return Mark of Fury to its owner's hand to allow you to keep casting this, keep cascading, keep drawing off of your Enchantresses. Nyxborn Hydra, kind of like the Mana Bloom, this is an X enchantment spell, so if you want to cascade for something larger, you like for example, if you don't have a shuffle ability and both of your 0-drops are already in your library, you can pay this for more mana, and if you pay where X is 2, then you would cascade for something less than 3 mana while this is on the stack. But it can also just be a 1 mana 0/1 creature that cascades into Crashing Footfalls. Also, this has Bestow, so you can pay 2 mana in X to put it onto a creature. It still has X 1/1 counters on it, but then also the equipped or the enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for the number of counters on this enchantment. And then if the enchanted creature dies, this falls off and becomes its own creature. So again, very flexible, can do a lot in this deck, sort of as needed, but at its baseline, it's a 1 mana enchantment. Prophetic Ravings, I guess we'll have to start looking at them this way. Prophetic Ravings is 1 red mana enchant creature. Enchanted creature has haste, again, and it also has tap to discard a card and draw a card. One thing that we are going to need to think about with this deck is the possibility that we just draw our Crashing Footfalls. That's going to make things difficult because we have no way of actually casting it. If it does get stuck in our hand, we may have to suspend it, which means we wait 4 turns until we actually get to cast it. So we are looking for abilities that discard cards from our hand into our graveyard in this deck. This is one of them that's pretty great because it gives the creature haste. You can discard your Crashing Footfalls if unfortunately for some reason you find it in your hand. And it is also a 1 mana enchantment that cascades into Footfalls if it is in your deck. But we have a few other cards that focus on being able to discard cards that we'll get to a little later in this video. We have Rancor, classic magic card. 1 mana enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+0 and has trample. And when it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return it to its owner's hand. So again, 1 mana enchantment, but it also fuels our commander damage plan, and it lets you cast it over and over. If the enchanted creature dies, it goes back to your hand, so you can get repeated value off of this one as well. Shaper's Sanctuary is a cool sort of protection card. Is 1 mana enchantment. Whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. So at the very baseline, this, if this is out and someone goes to kill Wildsear or one of your Rhinos or something like that, at least you get to draw a card off of it, which will continue to fuel your game plan. Sixth Sense, I think this is pretty much exactly the same as that other card we were looking at. It's a 1 mana enchant creature. Enchanted creature has whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. Another 1 mana enchantment that draws more cards. We have Spider Umbra, 1 mana Umbra armor. If enchanted creature would be destroyed, instead remove all damage from it and destroy this aura. And then it also gets +1/+1 and reach. So this is some good protection for Wildsear that also cascades into Rhinos. Unbridled Growth, again, this isn't ramp, it's fixing. Enchantland has tap to add a mana of any color. Excuse me, but you can also sacrifice this to draw a card, so it replaces itself. Whip Silk we talked about, just like that Crown of Flame, really great piece for this deck that you can use over and over, even in the same turn, as long as you have enough mana for it. And Wild Growth we talked about is a 1 mana ramp spell. So that is what we are doing with our 1 mana enchantments in this deck. Many of them are designed to draw you more cards or provide some form of other value while also cascading into your Crashing Footfalls to get those Rhinos onto the table. Let's see, I alluded to our discard package. We're only running 4 cards that can kind of do that, but let's look at those because again, if we end up with Crashing Footfalls stuck in our hand, it's not going to be the easiest situation to cast it. So we have a Bitter Reunion, 2 mana enchantment, enters the battlefield, you may discard a card, hopefully it's Crashing Footfalls, and then if you do, draw 2 cards. Also you can pay 1 and sacrifice this to give all of your creatures haste until end of turn. So that can provide a lot of value also after a turn of making a lot of Rhinos. You can just attack with all of them by paying 1 mana and sacrificing this. Also, it is an enchantment, so it fits into all of our enchantment synergies as well. We have Fear of Missing Out is a card that was spoiled from an upcoming set. As of the recording of this video, it is not actually out yet, but I think it just fits so perfectly into this deck that I wanted to include it here, and eventually it will be legal once it is released. But this is a 2 mana enchantment creature, 2/3, and when it enters, you can discard a card and draw a card, so it allows you to discard that Crashing Footfalls if it's stuck in hand. It also has Delirium, so if you have 4 or more different card types in your graveyard, whenever this attacks for the first time each turn, you can untap target creature, and then after this phase there's another combat phase. So this is pretty cool with Wildsear going for that commander damage. Also, if you do have that Delirium, which isn't impossible in this deck, you get to attack with Wildsear twice, which will kill an opponent pretty quickly with how much commander damage you're attacking for. Gyre Reach Sanitarium is a land. This is a colorless producing land, but it does enter untapped, and you can pay 2 mana and tap it, and each player draws a card and then discards a card. So another way to get those Cascade spells out of your, or the suspend spells out of your hand and into your graveyard. And then lastly, we talked about Prophetic Ravings, 1 mana enchantment. It can give a creature haste, but it also lets you discard if needed. So that's kind of what we're doing for our discard package. We have talked about our 1 mana enchantments. We have talked about our ramp package. We have talked about our shuffle package. We have talked about our Enchantress package. Let's look at I guess basically the last thing that we have to look at here is our removal. You'll notice it is rather light. We have 3 pieces of removal. There is an argument to be made that you should be running more, but for the sake of making this deck as consistent as possible, I am just running these 3 pieces, but they are good pieces of removal that also synergize with our deck because they're enchantments. So let's look at Cindervines. It is a red and a green for an enchantment that says whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, this deals 1 damage to that player. So it's kind of a little hate piece as well, but more importantly, you can pay 1 and sacrifice Cindervines to destroy target artifact or enchantment, and then it deals 2 damage to that permanent's controller. Very good to be able to remove a Rest in Peace or a Leyline of the Void or something specifically that's hating on graveyards. We want to be able to do that, so this card can come in clutch for that. Along those same lines, we have a Seal of Primordium, which is a 2-mana enchantment that says sacrifice Seal of Primordium to destroy an artifact or enchantment. Both of these are pretty cool because you can play them early on, get your Enchantress triggers, get your Cascade triggers, and then they can kind of just sit there until you need them, and when they are needed, then you can use them to remove whatever is necessary. Last piece of removal that we're running is Kenrith's Transformation. This is a 2-mana enchant creature that says when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. Great, it's going to continue to fuel your hand and continue to allow you to cast spells, but also it says enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a green elk creature with base power and toughness 3/3, and it loses all other card types and creature types. So this is a pretty efficient way to turn something into an elk that doesn't do anything else, and if you put it on somebody's commander, it can really slow them down. They will probably end up having to block with it in order to kill it, so then they can recast it, which is a whole bunch of extra steps. So for 2 mana that also draws you a card right off the bat, this is a great removal spell, especially since it's an enchantment. And that is pretty much all that we're doing with this deck. The lands are, I will say, very untuned at this moment in time. I would say you can tune them as much as you like. I'm running mostly basics here. Is there anything notable? Yeah, basically just a lot of basics and a few like cheap lands that tap for both of our colors. You can tune it as much as you like, but I have kind of gone the budget route with this deck, which is another important thing to note. Most of these cards are under $1. There's only a few that are a little bit more expensive, but for the most part, this is a very budget deck, and if you did end up wanting to build it, you could probably build it for close to the price of a pre-constructed precon. So another big plus with this one is that it is affordable because you're running a lot of janky 1-mana enchantments that wouldn't otherwise see a whole lot of play. But anyways, that's kind of what we have done with this build. I haven't actually built it yet in paper because Wildsear, as of the filming of this video, Wildsear has not been released yet. But I'm going to put it together, and I'm excited to play around with it. I've been goldfishing with it, and it seems pretty consistent. In general, turn 3 or 4, you're going to get your commander down, and then turn 4 or 5, you're going to start vomiting rhinos onto the field. So that's going to feel good. And as long as you can get those shuffle effects consistently and keep putting those suspend spells back into your deck, you're going to make a very large board very fast, very efficiently, and you are not going to run out of gas because that Enchantress package will just keep drawing you cards. So that's pretty much all I have to say about this deck tech. Let me know in the comments if you have any thoughts, recommendations, anything along those lines. I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about this, but I'm excited to put it all together and bring it to a table soon. So thank you so much for sticking around for this whole video. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, it really helps a lot, and I do intend to make more videos along this line, so you can stay tuned for the future. That's pretty much all I have to say, y'all. Thanks so much, and have a good one.